Eagle's Nest, Florida. On March 15th, 2003, David Shaw and Tim Mitchell drove to Weeki Wachee Springs for what they thought would be an exciting weekend dive. David was 34 years old and had logged over 200 open water dives in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Tim was 29, a recreational diver with 50 logged dives, mostly in Florida's Clear Springs. Both men were confident swimmers and experienced with deep air diving to 130 feet. Eagle's Nest was known among Florida divers as one of the deepest freshwater sites in the United States. The limestone sinkhole dropped to over 300 feet. What attracted recreational divers was the easy entry, a large opening with crystal clear water and natural light filtering down to 50 feet. David had heard about the cave system extending horizontally from the main shaft. Tim was curious about the formations he'd seen in magazines. They arrived at 10 a.m. with standard recreational gear. Single aluminum tanks filled to 3,000 psi, basic regulators with no backup air source, 2 small diving lights each, no cave diving training. They had never heard of continuous guidelines or the rule of thirds for gas management. The descent began easily. At 30 feet, the opening was 40 feet across with excellent visibility. At 60 feet, they could still see the surface clearly. The cave entrance became visible at 80 feet, a dark opening that seemed to beckon them forward. David checked his pressure gauge. Still plenty of air. Tim gave an okay sign and pointed toward the cave mouth. They swam through the restriction at 90 feet. The passage was 8 feet wide and 12 feet high. Natural light from the main shaft still provided some illumination behind them. They turned on their lights and continued forward. The passage sloped downward gently. At 120 feet, they passed through another restriction. The walls closed into 6 feet wide. Behind them, natural light had faded to a dim glow. David felt nitrogen narcosis at 140 feet. His thinking became fuzzy, but he had experienced this on deep ocean dives. Tim followed close behind, fascinated by the cave formation. Neither man had established reference points or noted their route. At 180 feet, they reached a large chamber with multiple passages. David chose the passage that seemed to slope upward, thinking it would lead back toward the surface. The passage continued downward instead. At 200 feet, both men were significantly narked. David's air consumption had increased dramatically due to depth and early anxiety. Tim was breathing harder, working to keep up. They had been underwater for 18 minutes. David checked his gauge, and 1,200 psi remaining. Time to head back. But which way was back? In the darkness beyond their lights, every passage looked identical. David made his best guess and led Tim into what he hoped was the return route. The passage narrowed to 4 feet wide. At 220 feet, with 800 psi remaining, David realized they were lost. Tim's gauge showed 600 psi. They had perhaps 8 minutes of air remaining at this depth. Panic breathing set in. David tried 3 different passages, each leading deeper or to dead ends. Tim followed, his movements becoming sluggish as carbon dioxide built up. At 260 feet, David's regulator began to breathe hard. Tim's air ran out first. David attempted to share air, but neither had trained for this emergency at depth while narked. Recovery divers found their bodies 5 days later at 280 feet depth in a passage running parallel to the correct exit route. They had been 50 feet from safety when their air ran out. The passage they needed was clearly marked with a permanent guideline that neither man had known to look for. On February 8, 2015, Sarah and Mike Thompson arrived at the Riviera Maya for their honeymoon diving trip. Sarah was 26 years old, a nurse from Denver, with advanced open water certification and 80 log dives. Mike was 30, a software engineer who had been diving for 5 years with 120 dives. They had completed 3 cenote dives earlier in the week, with certified guides. Local dive shops marketed it as suitable for advanced open water divers, emphasizing visual experience while downplaying technical cave diving skills required for safe penetration. They hired Carlos Mendez, a 35-year-old local guide who claimed 15 years of cenote diving experience. Carlos had advanced open water certification but had never completed formal cave diving training. He relied on familiarity with popular routes and his ability to memorize passage layouts. Carlos brought weighted markers instead of a continuous guideline, placing them at major junctions as reference points. This was common practice among undertrained cenote guides who didn't understand proper cave diving protocols. The group entered the water at 10:30 a.m. The cenote opening was spectacular. A perfectly circular pool 60 feet across, surrounded by jungle vegetation. Sunlight streamed through crystal clear water, illuminating limestone walls that dropped vertically to 40 feet, before opening into horizontal passages. Visibility was over 200 feet, making the underwater landscape appear deceptively simple and safe. They descended to the main passage entrance at 50 feet depth. Carlos placed his first marker and led them into the cave system. The passage was 15 feet wide and 12 feet high, decorated with massive stalactites and flowstone formations. Sarah swam beside Mike, both amazed by the cathedral-like beauty. At 200 feet from the entrance, they reached a major junction where 3 passages met. Carlos placed another marker and chose the right-hand passage. Carlos was confident in his navigation, but his memory was based on diving during dry season when water levels were lower. Recent rains had raised the water level by 8 feet, changing the visual references he used for navigation. The passage continued for another 300 feet, before reaching a large chamber decorated with delicate formations. They had been underwater for 22 minutes and were now 500 feet from the snowed entrance. Carlos led them toward what he believed was a shortcut back to the main passage. The route involved swimming through a restriction, then following a passage that curved back toward the entrance. However, the changed water level had altered the restriction's appearance. Carlos swam through an opening that looked familiar, but actually led to a different section of the cave system. After swimming for 15 minutes without seeing any markers, Carlos realized his navigation error. Sarah's pressure gauge read 1,000 psi. Mike had 1,200 psi remaining. The group split up to search for the correct exit route. Carlos swam toward what he thought was the main passage. Sarah and Mike stayed together, following a different passage that appeared to lead upward toward natural light. Sarah's air ran out first. Mike attempted to share air using his octopus regulator, but neither had practiced emergency air sharing in an overhead environment. The stress caused both divers to consume their remaining air rapidly. They were 150 feet from an exit passage, but without a continuous guideline, they had no way to navigate through the complex cave system. Carlos found his way back to the cenote entrance after 45 minutes underwater. Recovery teams found Sarah's body in a dead-end chamber, and Mike's body was discovered in a parallel passage 100 feet away. Shockingly, the investigation revealed that a continuous guideline would have led them to safety in less than 10 minutes, but the couple had died within 200 feet of two different exit routes. Kilsby Sinkhole, Australia. On November 3, 1989, Robert Chen arrived in Mount Gambier during a business trip to evaluate limestone quarrying operations for his Hong Kong engineering firm. Robert was 31 years old, a structural engineer with a methodical problem-solving approach and confidence in his technical abilities. He was an accomplished swimmer who had recently completed open water diving certification in Hong Kong's clear waters. Kilsby Sinkhole was carved from limestone by underground water flow over thousands of years. The site consisted of a perfectly circular opening 25 feet across, dropping vertically 200 feet to a series of horizontal passages. The main shaft was filled with crystal clear water, maintaining constant visibility and temperature. What made Kilsby dangerous was not the vertical descent, but the complex maze of passages extending horizontally from the bottom. Robert contacted a local dive shop and arranged equipment rental. The shop provided basic recreational gear. Single aluminum tank filled to 3,000 psi, standard regulator system, basic buoyancy compensator, and 2 small diving lights. When asked about cave diving certification, Robert explained he was an experienced engineer and confident swimmer who had researched the site thoroughly. The employee provided equipment without further safety questions. Robert's engineering background taught him to analyze complex systems methodically. He studied maps of Kilsby Sinkhole and read technical descriptions of the cave layout. On paper, the system seemed logical, a main vertical shaft with horizontal passages extending in 4 primary directions. Robert calculated air consumption rates, estimated swimming speeds, and planned a conservative dive profile. His engineering analysis couldn't account for 3-dimensional complexity of underwater navigation in zero visibility conditions. He arrived at 2 p.m. on a clear afternoon. The site was deserted, which Robert preferred for solo exploration. The descent began smoothly. At 50 feet, the circular opening above still provided adequate natural light. At 100 feet, he switched on his primary diving light. The limestone walls were smooth and featureless, carved into perfect cylindrical shape. Robert reached the bottom at 200 feet depth. 4 passages extended horizontally from the central chamber, each approximately 10 feet wide and 12 feet high. According to his research, the passages connected in a rough rectangular pattern. Robert chose the north passage and began horizontal exploration. His plan was to swim 200 feet into the passage, then return and explore the next passage clockwise. The north passage extended straight for 150 feet before making a 90-degree turn right. Robert followed the turn and continued swimming. The passage began to branch into smaller tributaries not shown on his cave map. Robert chose what appeared to be the main passage and continued forward. At 18 minutes into the dive, he realized he was lost. The passage had narrowed to 6 feet wide and showed no signs of opening into the main east passage. His pressure gauge read 1,600 psi, indicating he had consumed 1/3 of his air supply. Following proper protocols, this was his turnaround point, but turning around meant admitting navigation failure. Robert decided to continue forward, believing the passage would eventually connect with a familiar area. At 1,200 psi remaining, Robert's primary light failed. The bulb had been damaged during rental and finally burned out. Robert switched to his backup light, a small pen light designed for emergency use only. The weak beam provided just enough illumination to see passage walls immediately around him. Navigation became nearly impossible in the dim light. Robert attempted to retrace his route using limestone walls as reference points. In inadequate lighting, every section appeared identical. His air consumption rate had doubled from anxiety and exertion. The backup light began to dim as its battery drained. Robert found himself swimming in near-total darkness, feeling along cave walls with his hands. At 900 psi remaining, he made a final navigation error, swimming into a passage that led to a large chamber 400 feet from the entrance. In complete darkness, he felt frantically along the chamber walls, searching for any opening that might lead toward the surface. Recovery teams found Robert's body the following day in the dead-end chamber, his tank completely empty. The correct exit passage was located just 30 feet from where he died, clearly marked with a permanent guideline he had never been trained to recognize. Blue Springs State Park, October 14, 2018. James Morton was a 42-year-old commercial airline pilot from Atlanta with over 300 log dives. James believed his experience with deep ocean diving and professional pilot training would translate to underground environments. The entrance to Blue Springs cave system was protected by multiple warning signs. The largest, positioned directly at the cave mouth, displayed a white skeleton against black background with red lettering. "Stop, prevent your death. Cave diving requires special training and equipment." James entered the water at 3 p.m. with standard recreational gear. Single aluminum tank. Basic regulator, 2 small lights. The cave entrance was deceptively welcoming, a large opening 20 feet wide with excellent visibility extending deep into the passage. Natural light penetrated 80 feet into the cave, creating the illusion of a safe environment. James swam past the warning signs and entered the cave system. At 120 feet from the entrance, he reached a restriction, where the passage narrowed to 8 feet wide. Beyond the restriction, the passage opened into a large chamber with multiple exits. The passage he chose curved left after 200 feet, then branched into 3 smaller passages. James had been underwater for 15 minutes and was now 350 feet from the cave entrance. The passage he explored narrowed progressively until he was swimming through a restriction barely wider than his shoulders. When James attempted to turn around, he discovered the restriction was easier to navigate in one direction. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. His air consumption doubled as anxiety took over. At 1200 psi remaining, James finally extracted himself from the restriction but had become completely disoriented. He spent the remaining 20 minutes of his air supply searching for the correct exit route. Recovery divers found his body the following day, 50 feet from a clearly marked guideline that would have led him directly to the exit. Ginnie Springs, June 22, 2019. Lisa and David Park, a married couple from Ohio, were completing their final day of a Florida diving vacation. Both had advanced open water certifications and 150 log dives each. They climbed over a locked gate at 4 p.m., reasoning they would only enter far enough to take photos. The Ginnie Springs cave system began with a large well-lit entrance extending 100 feet, before branching into multiple passages. After 25 minutes underwater, they found themselves in a complex maze of intersecting passages. David's pressure gauge showed 1100 psi, Lisa's showed 900 psi. They had violated the rule of thirds for gas management. Every passage they tried led to dead ends or deeper into the cave system. David's air ran out first. Lisa continued searching alone, her remaining air lasting another 8 minutes. Recovery teams found both bodies in a dead-end passage 300 feet from the nearest exit route. Peacock Springs, March 15, 2020. Michael Rodriguez, a 29-year-old local dive instructor, decided to explore beyond his training limits. Michael had taught open water diving for 3 years, but always stayed within the natural light zone. On his day off, he decided to penetrate deeper into the cave system than ever before. At 250 feet from the entrance, Michael encountered a silt-out caused by his fin kicks, disturbing accumulated sediment. Visibility dropped to 0 instantly. Michael had never experienced a complete silt-out in an enclosed space. He became disoriented in the murky water, unable to distinguish between familiar passages and unfamiliar areas. Michael's body was recovered by fellow instructors who organized the search. He was found 180 feet from the cave entrance, in a side passage he had swum past safely hundreds of times. His tank showed 800 psi remaining, indicating he had died from drowning after removing his regulator in panic. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission found that every death could have been prevented by following basic cave diving protocols, proper training, continuous guidelines, adequate gas supplies, and buddy procedures. The warning signs these divers ignored contained the exact information that would have saved their lives.